Iowa State's problem on offense isn't the quarterback. It's that they're refusing to do the one thing that wins games: run the ball.
You are Locked On Cyclones, your daily podcast on the Iowa State Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, the number one sports podcast network. I'm your host, Nick Morovitz. Thank you for making this your first watch or listen of the day. I appreciate it more than you know. Be sure to hit subscribe so we can prove once and for all that it is, in fact, a Cyclone state. Today, we are back to football as Iowa State takes on Kansas this weekend in their season home finale. Going to be a huge game. So first place we got to go is the offensive side of the ball. I think they need to run the ball more. Is that the answer to beating Kansas? I'm going to say it. Yeah, I think so. But why? We'll talk about that in the first segment. Then second segment, we're going to take a look at Kansas. Is this a threat to Iowa State's pursuit of an 8-win regular season? Yes or no? And then finally, today, we are going to take a look at Iowa State coming off the bye. Obviously, 2 byes already this season, 1 win, 1 loss. Will this help Iowa State against Kansas? I think you can guess where my head is at, but to find out why exactly, you'll have to stick around to the end of the episode. Before we get that far, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download the app today. Getting started on the offensive side of the ball for Iowa State, this week, really, it only makes sense to me, because when I take a look at the offense versus the defense is so injury riddled, right? Like, just so beat up that what they're giving me is what I'm going to take. I obviously have a few thoughts on some things that could go better, but over the last few weeks, Iowa State's defense has shown up, more than I would expect them to at certain times for sure. So, I'm just kind of going to let that ride. Like, I'm not too pressed about the defense. They're just too beat up. But offensively, I feel like there's so much more that Iowa State could do. And I've said this all season. Like, I just don't know what's not clicking for Iowa State. We've talked about the amount of points scored compared to like how much offensive production this team is getting. And I just feel like something isn't there. So we obviously didn't play last week, so I had a little bit of time to think about it. And I think it's the run game. I think we need to utilize the running backs and or potentially Rocco in the run game a little bit more. I'm not saying we need to rush 45 times, 60 times a game. I'm not saying we need to get crazy with it. I do think, though, we have 2 extremely talented backs in the backfield. Let's use them. And we've already seen what Carson Hansen's done the last 3 weeks. We'll highlight that in a second. But boy, I think it's best to start with what we're getting from Rocco, because going into this season, Rocco, I said, was going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the Big 12. A lot of people at least had him in like the top 3, maybe 4 conversation. Granted, the Big 12 is a very good quarterback conference, but we just haven't quite gotten that level of play out of Rocco. Now, I think he's very capable of doing that, and I think if he comes back next season, we'll see something closer to what we were expecting from this year. But nonetheless, taking a look at his game log here, you can see the notable kind of right here. This is what I'm looking at, is the 0 in the passing touchdown column against Arizona. Now, Rocco Becht did have 22 consecutive games with a passing touchdown. And when that streak broke against Arizona, it is interesting, because that Arizona game, Iowa State won so handedly, 39-14. It was almost like a disguised red flag. That was kind of the beginning of the end. It wasn't, right? Cincinnati was the true beginning of the end of this season, but something was off in that Arizona game as well. Then you go into what Rocco's done over the last 5 weeks, and the number of interceptions is just, it's not ideal, right? 1 against Colorado, 3 against BYU. Remember where one of those did come from, though. 1 against Arizona State and 2 against TCU. In the last 4 weeks, 4. Yeah, that's a total of 7 interceptions of his 9 for the season. Something has certainly changed as far as Rocco or this past game. And I don't know the exact answer to that. I think it maybe comes down to the wide receivers just not catching enough balls. Certainly a number of the interceptions that Rocco has thrown hit his wide receiver. Was it a perfect pass? Maybe not. Some of them, no, for sure. But nonetheless, if it hits you in the hands, it's kind of your job as a receiver to catch it. So keep that in mind. Is it something with Taylor Mauser, something that, offensive scheme-wise needs to change? Maybe. Nonetheless, we're not getting top-tier quarterback play out of Rocco Becht as of late. We're not getting South Dakota play, 19 to 20, 278 yards, 3 touchdowns. We're not getting those stat lines. So why not pivot towards the running backs more? I think they should. I think Iowa State needs to utilize Carson Hansen and Abu Sama more this week against Kansas. Now, I will throw in, before I dive into those two, I think Rocco probably could stand to run the ball a little bit more, but I'm wondering if it comes down to some sort of coaching point, like, hey, Rocco, protect yourself. And on some level, yeah, we want Rocco to be completely healthy. And if that's where the coaching staff has him at, I trust them in that regard. But as far as Carson Hansen and Abu Sama, the notable stat, the number one thing I'm going to bring up is that over the last 3 weeks, Carson Hansen has surpassed 100 yards every single game. Had 152 against BYU, 113 against Arizona State, and 108 against TCU. Now, all 3 of those games, he had 16 or more carries. He went 16, 18, and then 28 over those last 3 in order, right, from BYU to TCU. 28 carries, kind of heavier, getting into that big kind of workload, and you don't want to go too much past 30. I feel like 30 is the mark where you're like, all right, now we're like the wear and tear system, like we're starting to wear and tear a little bit here. But then I looked at Abu Sama, and I noticed we haven't seen a ton of carries from the really elusive back that is Abu Sama. 9 against BYU, only 2 against Arizona State, and 7 against TCU. Now, could this be injury related? Potentially, yes. And if that's the case, then you kind of have to say what I'm about to say is null and void, right? If that's the case. But I don't see why Iowa State doesn't bump Abu Sama up into that mid-teens, low 20s, right? Why don't we run the ball nearly 50 times a game? I don't see why not. I know I said maybe 60 is a little bit far-fetched, but if we're going to get success in the run game, and Abu over the last 3 games has had 63, 14, and 30. So I just did the math prior to this. It was a ridiculous number, obviously 300 plus from Carson Hansen, and then that there is over 100. So I think it was like right around 450 yards of offense from the running backs alone over the last 3 weeks. We're having success with the running backs. We're having ups and downs in the pass game. Now, I will say the one point that doesn't go in the running back's favor is touchdowns. Over the last 3 weeks, I am kind of highlighting that because I feel like that's a notable point of emphasis, obviously, with Carson Hansen. 0 touchdowns from Sama, granted, not very many touches, and only 3 touchdowns from Hansen. So there is kind of that's missing, and Rocco over the last 3 weeks has thrown 3 touchdowns. So he has we have 6 touchdowns and 3 running, 3 passing. I obviously would like to see more touchdowns in general, but I just don't see why we don't run the ball more. I'm going to be completely honest. I think Hansen has the ability to get north and south and to create holes. That's one of my favorite parts about the Carson Hansen experience. If the hole isn't exactly there, Hansen's just going to run somebody over and create yards like that. It's not always going to be a massive 30-yard gain, but at least it's not negative. At least it's not handing the ball over to the other team. That's one of my favorite things about Carson Hansen in particular. And then as far as fumbles goes, not ideal. Obviously 2 fumbles from Abu Sama, and then for Carson Hansen, 1 against Iowa, but they've done a very good job of protecting the ball. I think if you're going the run route, yes, it's going to be harder on those 2 backs, and especially if you don't incorporate Rocco, but what I'm seeing is, more ball security, less likelihood of it being turned over, and more offensive production. I'm not saying we can't throw the ball, okay? I'm not saying that Rocco shouldn't have the ball in his hands come the end of the game or the end of the half or whatever, but definitely throughout the course of the game, let's lean a little bit more on the running backs. We're seeing in the numbers, the production is there. Something has to change for this offense to put up more points. Obviously, over the last 3 weeks, only 1 win and 20 points, 19 points, and 27. It's not exactly lighting the world on fire. I think something has to change, and we need to lean a little bit more into the run game, and I think we'll see success against this Kansas team. But how good is Kansas? How big of a threat are they to Iowa State's pursuit of 3 straight wins to end the season? We'll talk about that coming up right here after this. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you just want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push, and it's oh so much sweeter when you predict it. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Iowa State versus Kansas, not exactly been favorable over the last 3 years for Iowa State, but I think this is where Iowa State can turn the tides. And I'm saying it here at Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, now the #1 sports podcast network. I took a look at Iowa State's history against Kansas. 7-3 in their last 10. Those 3 losses coming in the last 3 years. Now, obviously, that's a streak that we want to put an end to, but Iowa State has gotten the better of Kansas 45 out of the last 98. So they're 45-53 and 6 all time against Kansas. This is such an interesting game because I'm going to talk a little bit about in just a second how I don't think Kansas is good. Spoiler. All right, stick around for why, but I don't think they're very good. I also don't think that really matters, unfortunately. Iowa, Kansas State, Kansas, all games, and I would honestly almost take Kansas State out of this, but games where it doesn't really matter who's better, it's going to be a tough matchup for Iowa State, for the opponent. It's just kind of one of those rivalry type situations, Cyhawk I've highlighted a ton of times, where it really just something is different in those games. I don't know if it's the emotion or if it's the stakes or whatever it is, but in those types of games, the better team doesn't always win, and that's football. Like, that's just how it works a little bit. But specifically against Iowa, Kansas, Kansas State, I would say are the 3 probably biggest for Iowa State. Now, Kansas, let's take a look at their schedule. Okay, they're 5-5 right now. It is worth noting that at 5-5, they're trying to win this game to become bowl eligible, and their last game of the season is against Utah. So I would assume a lot of Kansas fans are going to argue, or at least be cognizant of the fact that this is likely their last chance to make bowl eligibility. If Utah is what they say they are, and I did have a lot of comments about Utah earlier this season, and I guess that they've proved me wrong to an extent. So this is kind of the game that I'm assuming Kansas has circled as their 6th win, as their door that they can walk through into bowl season. So keep that in mind. But as far as Kansas's actual season, they beat Fresno State and Wagner to start, and then they kind of kept it close against Missouri, 42-31 and lost. But I honestly, that was where I thought Kansas might be a legit contender this season. I was wrong. Okay, let's take a look at the rest of their schedule, how it went. West Virginia, 41-10 victory. I think we all expected that. A loss to Cincinnati. That was kind of the turning point for where Cincinnati put themselves on the radar. We weren't sure yet, but we know Cincinnati's a good team now. They did beat UCF. They lost to Texas Tech and Kansas State. Then they beat Oklahoma State, and they lost to Arizona. Okay, so the way that I see this, it's pretty rare that you get it laid out this cleanly for you. Kansas beats teams they're supposed to beat, and they lose to teams that they're supposed to lose to. They're like right in the middle. They're not going to really, kind of exceed expectations. They're not going to outperform and beat someone they're not supposed to, but they're not going to really stumble, right? Against West Virginia or UCF or Oklahoma State. Those were, other than, I guess, UCF being a 1-score victory, those were pretty dominant wins. Like they get in, get it done. Obviously, the 2 wins at the beginning of the season as well. So my initial kind of thought is Kansas good? They're middle. They're mid, as they say. They're not really that great. They have the potential to beat teams. Obviously, they're better than UCF. They're better than West Virginia, better than Oklahoma State, but a lot of teams are, right? So I'm not too scared of Kansas right now from what we've actually seen on the field. Now, a couple players to look out for. Obviously, Jalen Daniels, all right? The dude really shocked me early on this season. I thought this was going to be kind of his year. So far, he is a 65% completion rate, 175 completions on 269 attempts. Definitely not the most in 2024. He threw 300 times, but the most outside of last season, and this season isn't over yet. So I assume he will surpass that. He's throwing more than ever. He's got 2,100 yards this season. But the biggest stat that I found from Jalen Daniels, and we'll talk about him more this week, but his touchdown to interception ratio is pretty ridiculous. 21 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. And to put that in, to put some context around that, Rocco is 12-9, 12 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. So not quite double the amount of touchdowns, but a third as many picks. And that ability to keep the ball safe is vital for Kansas. And obviously, if Iowa State is able to win that turnover battle, that'll be huge. If they're basically able to get Kansas out of their element where they are protecting the ball, that's going to be a big step in the right direction to help Iowa State win this game and kind of turn the tides. A few other names to look out for. They got a bit of a two-back backfield. Hishaw and Williams are the two dudes that are the actual running backs getting it done. Daniel Hishaw and LaShawn Williams. LaShawn Williams might ring a bell, played 4 years at Iowa prior to going to Kansas. Hasn't really done a whole lot this season, certainly done more than I think he did at Iowa, 414 yards and 6 touchdowns, while Hishaw Jr. has 430 yards and 4 touchdowns. So between the two of them, 840 or so yards and 10 touchdowns. All right. They have long, explosive play ability with Williams ripping off a 62-yarder this season. But it is worth noting that as we just kind of pivoted away from Daniels, he finds himself back in the conversation. Daniels is their third leading rusher at 345 yards on the season. Actually, their guy who's carried the most time. So he's 102 carries to Hishaw's 94. Means he's averaging less per carry, but he's getting out in the field more, obviously. He has 3 touchdowns of his own. And that's my biggest kind of thing to look out for in this game. Iowa State has struggled against mobile quarterbacks this season and in the past as a whole. How is the defense going to handle what Jalen Daniels can do for Kansas? Because he has done a very good job of protecting the ball, like I said, with only 3 interceptions, but he's also gotten outside the pocket, gotten upfield, is their third leading rusher. So he kind of can do it all. And Haycock's going to be put in a conversation, or in a situation where he's going to have to essentially stop just Jalen Daniels. That's how I see this. Now, of course, the running backs can pick up the slack. They can do what I think Iowa State needs to do, and they can, rush for 200 plus yards with that 2-back tandem. And if that's how they beat you, that's how they beat you. But Iowa State's been really good against the run this season, or at least much better than they have, in my opinion, than against the pass. Obviously, the Arizona State game, ugly, but I think they threw 3 times in the entire second half. Like, you got to kind of weigh out how the actual game went. But I would say that defensively, Iowa State's in an okay spot. Definitely needs to figure it out. Defensively for Kansas, I like where Iowa State's at. The amount of points that Kansas has given up: 21 to Oklahoma State. They gave up 42 to Texas Tech and Kansas State each, 37 to Cincinnati. We gave up 38. I think Iowa State has the ability to score a lot of points against Kansas if the opportunity presents itself. Now, like I said, this is still an Iowa State-Kansas game, so we'll see how it actually pans out. But I think Iowa State's offense, this is a game where they can go out and score 35 points, and I wouldn't be super shocked just based on what Kansas has done this season. So to round out the idea, is Kansas, going to be a challenge for Iowa State? I'm going to say yes, but not because of what we've seen this season. It's going to be because it's Iowa State versus Kansas. Like, I think Iowa State is a better team than Kansas. Now, I might be a little bit blinded, and I'm obviously kind of ignoring the 4 straight losses, and I'm only looking at the positives to some extent. But I do think that Iowa State is the better team, just plain and simple. Kansas, I think, has struggled, and I think that they're a very mid-level team. I would say Iowa State is just above them. And if Iowa State wins games they're supposed to, like this, and Kansas loses games that they're supposed to lose, I think this is a game that Iowa State's very capable of walking away with a W and their 7th win of the season. Now, obviously, we'll have to see because they're coming off a bye, and Matt Campbell doesn't necessarily love coming off the bye based on the quote he said earlier this season. So we're going to break down where I think Iowa State's at coming off of that rest, coming up right here after this. Iowa State, a lot of people looked at the bye schedule this season, myself included, and thought we are really in for a well-rounded year. The way that the bye is spaced out, I was very excited here at Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. But now it might be proving to be a bit of a problem. And I'll break down exactly why here as we dive into, is Iowa State better off coming off the bye, or would they rather maybe have not had a bye at all? But to kind of lay out some context here, before the season, remember, Iowa State had very evenly spaced byes. They played 4 games. Then after Arkansas State, they had a bye. Then they would face Arizona, Cincinnati, Colorado. They had a bye. BYU, Arizona State, TCU, they had a bye. And then 2 more games. So they never really had a long stretch of like 6 games in a row. And I was a big fan of Iowa State being able to, take on a chunk, regroup, get healthy, take on a chunk, regroup, get healthy. Unfortunately, I think that the counter argument to that I completely overlooked is the fact that Iowa State wasn't ever really able to get momentum going. Or I guess they did, in the first 4 games, but then with the byes kind of where they were, it lended itself to a 4 straight losing streak. Not ideal. I will say, another counterpoint, Iowa State needs the rest from an injury standpoint. We've seen some injury reports across the Big 12 that are 2-3 people long. Iowa State's is so long. We are now keeping guys that are out for the season just off the list because it's like we have the graphic isn't quite large enough to have every single guy who is, all the way from questionable to out. Like there's just too many players. So the bye has helped Iowa State in that regard. And I think that's going to be the biggest point that I make here for Iowa State in the positive category. But first, Matt Campbell did say, I believe it was ahead of Arizona that he said this. It was something like 70% of Power 4 teams lose coming out of the bye. And Matt Campbell hasn't been great coming out of the bye, but I kind of just wrote it off. I was like, it's whatever. Obviously, we're going to beat Arizona. We did. All right. That was honestly one of the highlights of the season because we're 5-0. We looked really good despite, the injuries that we had taken on at that point. But then coming off of the second bye, Iowa State loses to BYU. Here's the thing. My final take on this. Iowa State is better coming out of the bye. They beat Arizona handedly. They looked very good in that game. No Kyle Conrarty either. Didn't really need him, right? Got the 2-pointer early, and it never really was close enough where we needed to kick those kinds of field goals. We did put one in late, but I think that was more just from hey, here's a actual real live game field goal more than like anything else. I think it was just a kind of a practice situation for Iowa State. And then against BYU, it's a 41-27 final score. Okay. BYU won that game. I'm not going to argue that, but I have talked about many times on here how I think Iowa State was maybe the better team than BYU on that day in a lot of situations. Now, the times where they weren't better really hurt them, specifically the punt, right? The punt that Iowa State should have come away with the ball, but we end up having a player step on it and BYU falls on it and whatever. We're not breaking that play down today. But my point is, a large portion of that game, Iowa State was a lot better than BYU. And I stand on that. I think they were absolutely ready. They were fully rested. And the loss call, like adding one to the loss column, doesn't look good. Like that's easy to just glance at and say, well, Iowa State's 1-1 coming off the bye. But when you remember how Iowa State played against Arizona, against BYU, I think that's huge. And I think especially with where Iowa State is at injury-wise this season, now that's a whole another conversation, but where Iowa State's at injury-wise this season, they needed this bye. The big win against TCU, you could make the argument that they needed to ride the momentum, but it didn't really feel like it just kind of felt like they fell their way into that one. I did tweet out, I feel like this is a game that Iowa State finds a way to win, and they did end up winning it. But when you watch it back, it really wasn't like some super dominant, you can feel the snowball getting bigger as it rolls down the hill type of win. It didn't really feel that way. So I'm not against the bye at this point. Obviously, it's not like we get a choice. It's not like I'm saying Matt Campbell should have or shouldn't have called this bye. It's just how the season worked out. But I think Iowa State's going to be better coming off this bye than worse. Now, there's going to be conversation of Matt Campbell's going to say, we got to be ready. We got to light a fire under our rear ends and come out and beat Kansas. I think that's absolutely true. And there absolutely is that element of, getting back into gear, not necessarily rusty with only 1 week off, but certainly getting back up to game speed. I think it does deteriorate quite quickly in that bye week, kind of just understanding what the opponent's going to do. So maybe we'll get a rough quarter, maybe out of Iowa State, but I don't anticipate that. I honestly expect, with the way those 4 straight losses went, I think we're going to get a coaching staff who is super prepared. I mean, I don't know if they took any more than a 30-minute break to look away from film or from practice. Like I'm sure they know exactly what Kansas is going to do, how they're going to attack every front that Iowa State sends out there, offensively and defensively. I think that Iowa State's coaching wise going to be in a very good spot ahead of Kansas. And that's going to be a huge point, because I've said all season long, I don't think Iowa State's coaching is putting them in the best position to win these games. On 3rd and long, why do we have cornerbacks 8 yards off? Or on 3rd and short, excuse me. Why do we have cornerbacks 8 yards off? Quick slant, quick hitch. All of a sudden, they're extending their drive. How are teams converting on 3rd and long consistently? Feels like maybe that's a scheme issue. Not always, but certainly sometimes. Offensively, why are we running essential trick plays on like every random 3rd down or in tight situations close to the goal line? Why are we running sprint outs on 3rd and 5 from the 7? Like, I don't love that play call. I don't think that's maybe the best thing for this team or this quarterback. I don't know why those are the situations that these coaches are putting these players in. And so I think if the coaching staff is at the level I expect them to be, we're going to win this game. Player-wise, obviously taking a week off to let everyone rest, recover, get back into their habits, that's also a good thing. Because while the injury list on like the questionable, probable, doubtful, out, that whole list is ridiculously long for Iowa State, it is not even funny how many guys are out, not only for this game, but for the season, how many guys are extremely banged up going into this game. That list is only a tiny portion of the actual players on the team. Everyone on the team at this point is dealing with something. Even if it's just a little bit of a soreness, if it's a little bit of a twang here, they come into practice, not necessarily, I don't want to say they're limping, but there is an element of like, you kind of walk away from practice a little bit stiffer than maybe you did at the beginning of the season, or you're walking a little bit stiffer than you did at the beginning of the season. That's just how football goes, right? That is literally just the name of the game. I'm not saying that's just Iowa State. That's every football team across the country. So it definitely helps to get a bye this late in the season. Now you've got essentially a fresh start at the last 2 weeks. You grab the dub, vibes are high. Okay. Now you got an opportunity to regroup, get fresh, and take on these last 2 weeks to move to 8-4 on the season. A number that I think at the end of that 4-game losing streak, I wouldn't be surprised if anybody, like I was doubtful even of 8-4. That felt a very long ways away. Now it's very doable. Big win over TCU, and you're fresh, you're ready. Coaching wise, I think they're very prepared. You had an opportunity to watch a ton of film on Kansas. This is the time where Iowa State strikes. I think they've done that over the last 2 byes as well, even though BYU ended up being a loss. I think they looked really, really good in that game. As Matt Campbell says, it's just going to come down to the details. It's going to come down to, the centimeters, the fabric. Just that much needs to go Iowa State's way, and I think they beat Kansas. I do. At least at this point in the week, I do. We'll take a look as the week continues. We'll talk maybe, who knows? Who knows? We'll talk around. We'll do some film research, and we'll learn a little bit more. But as of right now, I think Iowa State's in a very good spot to beat Kansas. That being said, thank you for listening till this point in the episode. Be sure to hit subscribe down below so we can prove that it is, in fact, a Cyclone state. Until next time, Cyclone fans, sayonara.